In the last video, we started working on our quiz game. We got the prompt version working. We got the HTML and CSS working. And then we left the building the real version of our game until this video. So I'm picking up where I left off in the last video, where we had our styling, our stats that were styled on the page, and we had our template down here for injecting content on the page, which left us looking like this, where we had some styled stats, and then we had a hidden template that we could then use in our JavaScript later. So what I want to do is go into our quiz game folder and create a game.js file. This is going to be our real game as compared to our prompt game version. And then we can go ahead and import that into our index to get it running. And let's test out a few things inside of this game to make sure that our HTML is set up properly. So we had a few elements on our page that we needed to get access to change them dynamically. We had this score, the level, the question, the template, and then that hidden div where we're going to inject questions. So I'm going to want to create a score element that we document query selector, and I believe we called that score with an ID. So if I flip back here, we're trying to grab this element that has an ID of score. I want to do the same thing for level and question number. And you know what, level, let's ignore that for now. You know, later when we create a more complicated version of this, maybe we'll use the level. So let's just grab the score and the question number and make sure those are working. Question number element is document.query selector hash. We called that question number. That was the ID. So first things first, let's print those out. And you can actually, if you want, print out multiple things to console log by separating them by commas. So here, if things went well, then we should see 2 elements print out. And if they went wrong, we'll see null print out in one of these spots. So there we go. We got 2 printing out here. If I make this a little larger, we can see score. When I hover over it, it's showing me the element. So score is getting that 0, and this is giving me 1 out of 10. So testing, let's try score element dot text content. Let's set it to 10. Make sure that that works. There we go. Score is loading at 10. And let's try the question number element. We'll set it equal to, well, let's just do a regular string, 2 out of 15. Let's see if that works. Oh, made a mistake here. We can see assignment to a constant variable because I didn't say question element dot text content. There we go, 2 out of 15. So we're good. We can access those, manipulate them. Next up, let's make sure that we can get access to this trivia container. So we said that this had an ID of trivia-container. Let's add it to our console log. Good, it's showing up. And let's test it out. Let's do our insert adjacent HTML. Before the end, let's put in a paragraph that says testing. There we go. We got some text showing up. That's good. The last element that we created in the previous video that we want to get access to is this template. So we called that trivia item template in terms of the ID. So let's flip back here and grab our template. Trivia item dash template. Let's add that to our console log. You can see our template printing out, and notice that when I hover over it, nothing is selecting on the page because that template is just in memory. It's not actually rendered to the page somewhere. It's not placed on the page. So let's continue the testing here. This is just purely making sure that we know what we're doing before we actually start building the game. Let's use that trivia item template. So let's call a variable here, test trivia item. We are going to use the trivia item template, and this is slightly different than the elements that we're getting here. It has a slightly different API. We can ask for the content from it, from a template, and once we have that content, we can clone that element. So we are getting access to whatever's in the template. So that would be this div, and then we are asking that div to be cloned. And this true variable is saying, clone it recursively. So if it has children elements, make sure to do a deep clone of all of those. So let's print that out to see what we've got. We can see it's a document fragment. And if I expand it, we've got our div, our paragraph, our unordered list with our list items. And you can see that the button is empty, our paragraph is empty, there's no content filled in yet. So let's try putting this new item on the page. So we can grab our trivia container and we can append child, which is the method on elements that allows us to put an element inside of another element. So here we're saying into the trivia item container, let's add our test trivia item. And remember, those, like the paragraph and buttons, are blank, but we should still see something here on the page, some empty buttons. So once we have this trivia item, we can actually grab like the question and the buttons from it and start filling them in. So if we do this, question element is equal to test trivia item dot query selector trivia item question. What we're doing is getting an element, so our test trivia item, and we are asking for a child of it. We're asking for the element that matches a class of trivia-item underscore question. And that's what we created last time down here, trivia item question, as this paragraph. So we could do question element dot text content is equal to some test that's showing up on our page. And actually, if we go, let's go back here and let me grab the Magic the Gathering one that has this weird HTML escape character in it. Paste it in, and it's showing up with those escape characters in it. These escape characters are actually HTML code. So instead of saying the text content, which sets the text inside of an element, if we do inner HTML equals this, we're actually setting the HTML inside of that element. So we can actually put HTML escape codes. We could put child HTML elements in there. There we go. So now it's no longer that weird formatting of an escape code. It is the actual quotation mark, double quotes. So let's keep going here. We've got our question that we filled in. And again, all of this is still testing. We're going to format this into the game structure after we've got this working. So let's grab the button elements using test trivia item. And here we're, instead of doing query selector, we're going to do query selector all. And we're going to ask for anything that matches our trivia item button class. And remember, this is the class that we put, if we flip back to index, on each of these buttons. So when we query selector all, it's going to give us something that's very much like a list or an array of all of those HTML elements. Let's get rid of this console log, and we will use it to print out the button elements instead. So the thing that we get back isn't quite a list, but it is similar to a list. And it's got 4 elements. It's got each of those buttons in it. And you can see, because we're putting this on the page, as I hover over them in the console, I'm seeing them highlighted on the page. So let's just treat it like an array, and we're gonna hard code this. Button elements 0 is equal to, and I'm gonna flip back to here. We've got purple, brown, pink, orange. Purple. Whoops. Button element dot inner. HTML is purple. Brown will be the next one. And I've already forgotten purple, brown, pink, orange. Pink will be the next one. And orange will be the last one. We can get rid of that console log. So there we go. Purple, brown, pink, orange. They're being displayed. They're not shuffled yet. And this isn't a great way for us to put them on the page, but we have an individual question put on the page now from JavaScript, as opposed to being hard-coded in here in HTML. So we've got our elements, we've got our testing code that we made sure that everything worked. So let's turn this into a banner here. And I'm going to remove some of the white space and comment this out. And at some point, we're going to refer back to this as we're working, and we'll use a lot of the code that we developed here in the actual game logic. But for now, I just don't want any of that running and interfering. So approaching this game and building it out, there are a number of ways that we could structure our code. So we could take the object-oriented approach of thinking about the game that we're trying to build and breaking it down into classes and making instances of those classes. So for instance, we might have a game class that holds on to the score and the current question and the level. And then we have a trivia item class that represents each question in our game. That's fine. That is perfectly valid if we were building a JavaScript version that used no framework. Maybe we would approach it that way. But the world of React, which is where we're heading soon for structuring our user interface logic, tends to be more functionally oriented than object oriented. So what we're going to do is think about the application we're building as a couple of pieces of state that we will maintain as variables in this file, and then a couple of functions that we'll need to run at specific points in the life cycle of the game. So in terms of variables, let's start with those first. We're going to need one that represents the score and probably one that represents where we are in our array, in addition to having our array of all of the questions. So let's create a variable for score, and we'll set it to 0. We will create a variable for our trivia item index. So this is where we are in our array. And we're also going to need an array of trivia items. When we're working on those trivia items in this file, we only had 3 in here, but this already took up a ton of screen real estate. So this would be a mess if we had like 20 questions in our game.js. So what I actually want to do is create another module that stores this array that we'll be able to import into this file. So I'm going to create a trivia items.js file, and I want to create a variable called trivia items that is equal to an array. And what I want to put into this array is the questions from our trivia API. So I'm going to flip back to my browser where I still have my tab open from last time. So we are using the open trivia database, opentdb.com, and I just want to configure this. Let's say that I want 10 questions from, I guess let's stick with board games, which is what we did last time. Make sure that they are multiple choice. Click generate the API URL. Whoops. I think because I had this open for a while, it broke. So let's try that again. Let's grab the board games, multiple choice, generate that API URL. There we go. Here's the new one. Pop that open in my browser, and we can see the JSON, the JavaScript object notation, and inside of this results array are a bunch of objects that represent the questions and their answers. So what I want to do is start at this first object and copy all of the objects here and stop at the last curly bracket for the final object. And these I'm going to paste in between the opening and closing of my array in my trivia items.js file. And you can see when I paste it, it's going to be a mess because it is being copied and pasted from not well formatted JSON. But when I save it, my prettier should kick in, and actually my prettier is going ahead and removing some of the double quotes that were not necessary now that we're in a JavaScript file. So we should be good here. We've got our trivia items variable. The thing is that this variable, remember with the module syntax, anything that we create in here is scoped to this file. So if we were to try to reference trivia items here, this is going to give me an error. When I save it and try and run it in the browser, it doesn't know what that is. So what we need to do is export trivia items from this file so that we can use it in game.js. So after this variable has been defined, what I want to do is scroll down to the bottom and export it. There are 2 ways that you can export. One is with a default export. So if your file exports a single thing, this is probably what you want. The other way that you can export things is using named exports. So you could export an object that has trivia items within it. This format is good when you need to export a bunch of things, like maybe you're exporting like trivia items and like player stats and all sorts of other stuff. You would just format them in an object and be able to export multiple things. But since we only have one here, we just have the trivia items, we're exporting it as default. So then back in game.js, we can head up to the top of our file here and import trivia items from trivia items.js. And I'm making sure that I saved my trivia items.js file next to my game file so that I can use this relative import here. If I did that right, there we go. We should see 10 things showing up in our console, and each one should have the correct answer, incorrect answers, question, type, etc. Okay, so we have our state of our application, which is our trivia items, our score, and our trivia item index. What we now want to do is start mapping out some of the functions that we're going to need for this game to run. So I think this testing stuff, I'm going to just keep that at the bottom of my file so that it's not distracting us as we're going. And I'm going to create a few functions here. Let's create a function for updating the score, a function for updating the question number, a function for display trivia, and a function for when an answer is clicked. So these are the heart of our functional approach here. We just have a couple of functions that we're going to run at specific times to get this game working. So update score is going to be responsible for making sure that this score variable keeps in sync with our score element that's on the page, so that anytime we need to change the score, we go through this function and it'll make keep those in sync. The question number is going to do a similar thing with our index and the question number element. So if we are on index 0, we're at that first thing in the array, then we'll say question 1 of however many things are in the array. Display trivia item is going to be responsible for doing our logic here, where we were cloning our template and filling it out and putting it on the page. And onAnswerClicked is going to run anytime we click on one of these buttons on the page. So it'll be responsible for checking whether or not things are right or wrong. So I might as well put these in comments. Keep our score variable in sync with the UI, the user interface on the page. Keep our index in sync with the UI. Clone our template and fill it in with a trivia item. Check if the answer picked was correct or incorrect. And one more while we're at it, let's throw this one, clear trivia. And this one is going to be responsible for clearing trivia items from the page. So when we click on one item and we need to go to the next one, we want to make sure that we remove that last one before we add another one to the page so that we don't end up with multiple on the page. So in order to build these out, I think, or in the order that we should build these out, we'll start with some of the easier ones like update score, update question number. We will then start working on some of the harder ones like display trivia item and onAnswerClicked. So our update score function, I think what we want to do is make sure that when we call it, we pass in a new score. We can set our score equal to that new score. And then just make sure that we also take our score element, set its text content to be the score. Let's bring these side by side again. So down at the bottom, if I call update score 10, we should hopefully see, whoops, I had the wrong one open here. our score changed to 10. If I call it 20, our score is set to 20. So anytime we want to change the score, we can just use this function. And if we want to increment the score, we can just say, score plus 1. So it'll go from 0 to 1. If I do it twice, it'll go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2. And we'll add a to-do here later. That it would be great if anytime this score changed, there was something to draw your attention to the score changing. But for now, this function's done. We're 1/5 of the way there. So let's go ahead and update our score to be 0 when the application starts, and let's do the question number. So question number, we're going to use this question number element. So question number element dot text content equals, and we want to do something like 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 15. This 1 is our trivia item index, and 15 is how many trivia items we have. So instead of making this a normal string with double quotes, I'm going to make this a template string, which means that I could insert like trivia item index in here. And if I call update question number to get it running, we can see it now displays 0 because this variable, the index, is driving that. And if I change the index to 2, to 2, we should see 2 showing up here. But this is not quite right? Once we're on the index 0, which means that we are on the first element in this array, we're really on question number 1. So instead of displaying 0, we want to add 1. We want to say 0 is really question number 1. This index, which would be 1, is really question number 2, and so forth. So let's create a question num. Variable is trivia item index plus 1, and we will throw that in here. So now our 0 becomes a 1, and we can say total num questions is equal to our trivia items dot length. And now we should see 1 out of 10. And if you want, you could just, instead of creating local variables, you could just shove that in here directly into the string and throw that directly into the string here. So let's make sure that this works, that it stays in sync with our array. So if I come back into my trivia items array, and maybe I will comment out the last 3 questions. So I'm just going to select these last 3 objects, comment it out. We should now see, instead of 10, 7. And if I uncomment them, 1 out of 10. Excellent. So we've got our score and our update question number done. Now we want to be able to display a trivia item to the page. So we have our state variable, our trivia item index up here, and we have our array, trivia items. So if we wanted to get the current trivia item, we could do this. Const trivia item is equal to our array, trivia items, and then we'll use our trivia item index. And let's print that out. So if we call display trivia item down here, we should see that first question about Yahtzee. Yep, how many dice are used in the game of Yahtzee, which corresponds to, in our trivia items, all the way at the top, the first question, how many dice are used in Yahtzee? And if we change this, the index to 1, we should see this one print out in our console about how many dots are on a single die. So let's temporarily save this, change our index. How many dots are on a single die is printing out to the console. If I change it back, we're back to Yahtzee. So once we have that data, the trivia item, it's just a matter of connecting it to this logic that we wrote before, which allowed us to clone the template and start putting things into the template. So to kick things off, back in here, let's grab these properties from our trivia item that we did with destructuring in the previous video: the question, the correct answer, the incorrect answer. So the question, the correct underscore answer, the incorrect underscore answer from trivia item. And let's print these three variables out to make sure that we've got them. Aha, I've already made a mistake. So you can see how many dice are used in the game of Yahtzee: 5 undefined. So it's always really good as you're building to check that each thing you did works, even if it's as simple as just console logging. You will catch errors earlier that will be easier to debug than if I had built 5 things and then found some mysterious error. So the mistake I made here, if I go back to my trivia items, is that I was trying to grab this array, which is called incorrect underscore answers, not incorrect answer. So I'm going to select this, hit F2, which allows me to rename, whoops, actually let's not do that because that did a more complex version of renaming that we'll talk about in a second. Okay, there we go. So we've got our 3 variables here. The more complex naming that you saw, so we've seen simple destructuring, which will pull out into a local variable called question the property question from trivia item. Now, if you weren't happy with the property names here, you can do a renaming when you're creating your variables. So for instance, if I double click on correct answer and then hit F2, and let's say I really don't like the naming convention with the underscore and I want to make it our camel case and hit enter, you can see that Visual Studio is allowing me to rename that. And the structure here is that the property from the object goes on the left and then the new name goes on the right. And I could do the same thing here, and if I do it manually, it's incorrect answers on the right, like this. And then I will update my console log to make sure that they're printing out. So you can do the normal destructuring without this renaming, and then your variables will have to match exactly what you're destructuring. This trivia item, and you can see IntelliSense is able actually, in this case, to pick up what the structure of our trivia item looks like. So you can do this destructuring without renaming. For this version, I'm going to go ahead and rename them to match our naming conventions so that we don't have to type correct underscore answer when we use it later. Let's label this object destructuring with renaming properties. So now we've got 3 variables: question, correct answer, incorrect answers, that we can start using with our logic from before. So I'm going to copy and paste this and ignore my calendar events. Bring this back in here. So the first thing we need to do is clone that template. So let's clone it and call it trivia item instead of test trivia item. And again, let's console log it to make sure that we've got this working. Aha, yes, I have already made another mistake. So console logging, stopping to try and console log revealed an error. So I wasn't paying close attention, and I tried to create another variable called trivia item, which we've got up here. I think what makes more sense, trivia item is our data, so calling it trivia item is fine. This element here is a element on the page. So I think what would make more sense would be like trivia item element as the name. So now we can see a document fragment where we've got our paragraph that's empty and our unordered list with buttons in it that are also empty. It's not on the page yet, so let's get something on the page. And that was where we did this at the bottom, trivia container dot append child, and we want to take our trivia item element. So there we go. Showing up on the page, blank. So we need to fill these things in. So we can get rid of our console log for testing now that that's working. Let's get our question element. And let's go full screen here. So instead of passing in our string hard-coded here, I'm going to delete this. The question element's inner HTML should just be whatever's in our question variable. Oop, got another error here. I forgot that, again, we're doing this renaming. So here, as we're going, instead of test trivia item like before, it is now trivia item element. Okay, here we go. We got how many dice are used in a game of Yahtzee. Questions already displayed. So this is great. Now we need to do our buttons. So this is trivia item element. Grab all of the buttons in an array. And let's just, to see something working, do this not really great way of putting stuff on the page. So we will put the correct answer here. Let's put the incorrect answers 0 here. Incorrect answers 1. Incorrect answers 2. And check it out. How many dice? 5, 4, 6, 8. So this is okay. We got something displaying on the page, which is a positive, but it's not shuffled. And this way of putting these buttons isn't great. We should probably be using a loop here rather than reaching in and accessing each element one at a time. So let's start with shuffling. We already solved this problem before. If we go back to our prompt version, we did our destructuring, and then what we did was we shuffled the correct answer and the incorrect answers together to get an array with all of the answers. So we just need to do that same process using the same shuffle utility. So that shuffle was written in this shuffle.js file, so we got to import this first, and then we can use it. So importing, we do at the top of our file, import shuffle from shuffle.js. After we do our destructuring, let's create our shuffled answers. And remember what we were doing last time is we created a new array and we passed it in as a parameter. So we said, here is the correct answer. And then we used the spread operator to say, here is an array of incorrect answers. So this operation creates a new array with the correct answer followed by each of the incorrect answers. So we should be able to, down here, do all answers 0, all answers 1, all answers 2, all answers 3. And now every time I refresh the page, the answers we've got are shuffling around, which is good. But let's improve this. So if we changed our game to feature 3 answers or changed our game to feature 5 answers, we would have to come and update this code. So it would be better, like future proofing, if we start thinking about using a loop here because we're doing a repetitive action. So let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is loop over our button elements. And I'm going to use a for each here. Whoops. Here we go. And just to kick it off, let's console log button and index so that we can see them. So button elements, that is our node list of all of the buttons from our template. For each is going to run this arrow function over each of those buttons. So we should see each of those buttons print out here with the index associated with it. So this is index 0, that first button. Here is index 1, that second button, which is over here. Index 2, this third button. Index 3, this fourth button. So we can just say button inner HTML and then use this index for our all answers. So each time we loop through, we're getting a new index. So we start at 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, and we're just grabbing the corresponding answer from our shuffled array of 4 answers. And let's go ahead and get rid of this hard-coded code. So now, as we refresh it, we should see these answers still shuffling around. But it was less logic and a little bit more maintainable looking to the future. One caveat here is that we have designed our HTML, our template here, to assume that there are 4 answers. So if we ever want to come back and adjust this, we actually do need to think a little bit more about restructuring this. So if we want to have true false questions and multiple choice, we'd have to come back here and update it. But even still, the loop is a better choice for us to think about how to structure this piece of code. Because the next thing we want to do is each of these buttons, we want to register a click handler. So remember, we've done that previously by saying element.add event listener, listening for click, and then we pass in a function here that should be run when the button is clicked. And we've got one down here, onAnswerClicked. So let's call onAnswerClicked, and into this function, let's just do console log you clicked an answer. So each time I click any of these, now that click handler is running over in our console. Let's keep filling out the onAnswerClicked function. And one thing that we haven't talked about is that when you register an event listener, there is actually a parameter that is going to be supplied to you to this function, and it is an event. So if we console.log event here, and check it out in the browser, when we click on one of these, we are getting a mouse event because we listen to click, which is a mouse event. And if I expand this, we can see there are all sorts of properties in here about this. So there's information about where on the screen this button is and our mouse is, or sorry, there's information here about where our mouse is when we clicked. And there is also a target property here, which gives us the element that we clicked on. So once we get the target, we would actually be able to read what's in that button to say, is this the correct answer? Is 5 the correct answer? So we want to grab the target here. And let's print out target dot inner HTML. So each time I click, it's printing out the HTML of that button. So 4, 6, 8, 5. So now we know what we have actually clicked on. So we could call this the selected answer is equal to target.inner HTML. And one thing that I want to point out here is that sometimes we're using text content and sometimes we're using inner HTML. And basically, this using inner HTML has to match the fact that we put information in there using inner HTML. So HTML is what we have stored in the correct answer and incorrect answers. And that's because the correct answer and incorrect answer can have those HTML escape codes in it. Okay, so we now in our function here know which answer we have clicked on, so we can actually then check what's the correct answer. And the way that we can do that is by using, let's go start typing this out, trivia items, trivia item index. So this would give us the current displayed trivia item. So we could call this trivia item. And then we know that the trivia item, the structure of that, and you can see the IntelliSense is popping it up for us here, has the correct underscore answer property. So we can say the correct answer is equal to trivia item dot correct underscore answer. So with the correct answer and the selected answer, we can compare those two. So if the selected answer is equal to, with 3 equal signs, the correct answer, let's console log correct. Whoops, what am I doing here? Correct with an exclamation point in the string. Otherwise, console log incorrect. So we should be able to click here and get the right answer. So I actually don't remember, so I'm just going to click a few of them. So 8 is incorrect, 4 incorrect, 5 correct, 6 incorrect. So it looks like it's working. I'm just going to double check the data to see, yes, 5 is the correct answer. Let's tie this to our user interface so we know when it's the correct answer, we should go ahead and update the score. And we will set it to be score +1 or +10 or however many points you want to give folks for getting something correct. So we should be able to click on 5 and see our score going up by 1 each time. Looks good. So what we want to handle now is similar to when we were doing the prompt version. Here we were using a loop to go through each trivia item. We can't use a loop when we're doing this interactive user interface on the page because we're waiting for the user to do something. But we still need this structure where our index is going up by 1 each time that the loop was giving us. So back in our game, after the user gets the feedback for correct answer or incorrect answer, then we want to go to the next trivia item. So we could do something like this, trivia item index plus equals 1, and then force our trivia to redisplay. So display trivia item. But this is going to have a couple of problems with the way we've got it currently. So first problem here is that each time we select an answer, they're showing up sequentially on the page, and we want an experience where you're only really seeing one question at a time. The other problem was if I just keep going all the way through all of the questions, at a certain point it's going to break. Why is it breaking? Well, if we check out the error here, whoops, I'm in the wrong window. Cannot destructure property question of trivia item. What's happening is that our index here has gone past the length of our array. So when we go to display something in display trivia item and we pull out the trivia item and we try and destructure the information from it, there's nothing there because it's undefined. We've gone past the length of our array. So we need to do two things. We need to make sure that we clear that trivia before we go ahead and display the next one. and we need to make sure that we don't actually go past the length of our array. So let's solve the going past the length of our array first. So what we're going to do is, after we add to our trivia item here, let's go ahead and check, is the trivia item index equal to trivia items dot length. So if it's at the length, then we have just added one to go past the last element in our array. For this basic version, we'll just do like an alert, game over, your final score is, and we'll print out the score. In future versions, we would actually want to have another page, like a summary screen that let the user know how they were doing or how they did. Here, it's fine to just print out in an alert because this is a simple version of the game. So if we have hit the length, that's it. Otherwise, we can display the next trivia item. So let's go ahead and head back to our trivia, and I am going to comment it out so that we only have 2 questions here. So I've just left the first 2 items in our array. So I should be able to click on this one, and get the game over with our final score printing out. So that's one issue solved. The next issue is that we want to clear our trivia anytime we're going ahead and displaying the trivia. So there are a number of ways that we could clear the trivia. We could reach into the inner HTML of our container here. So remember, the container is the thing we were putting our copies of the trivia item template into. So we could just like clear the inner HTML. The other way we can do it is we can loop over all of the child elements of this div and remove them. So I'm going to show you that way. So we've got our trivia container, and the trivia container and your DOM elements have a children property that is iterable. So we can do const child of trivia container dot children trivia container dot remove child. So what we're doing here is going through that iterable of all of the HTML elements that are child nodes of our trivia container, so anything that's in there, putting it into our child variable using our for/of structure. And then the way that you remove an element is to have the parent dot remove child and then pass in the child. It's a little bit verbose, but this does the job. So I think what we want to do, let's have it clear the trivia here. So after we've checked whether they're right or wrong and we're about to move on to the next one, we'll go ahead and clear the trivia that's on the page. So we should now be able to click and the page will clear and display the next trivia item until we get to the end. And this is where you'd want to have an end screen, but it does clear that final trivia item from our page. So we're close here. There are a couple of extra bits of polish to add to this. So one is that it's really jarring when you click and everything disappears immediately. So instead, what I want to show you how to do is animate those elements so that they disappear. And because we'll be animating them, it'll allow us to actually show some feedback on these buttons as to whether the user got it right or wrong. Because right now it's really hard to tell whether you got it right or wrong. So we're going to start with fading out our trivia instead of immediately clearing it like we're doing here. So what we want to do is get access to the element that's on our page. Let me show you it here. So on our page currently, in our trivia container, we have this div. That is the div that contains the current trivia. We want to fade this out. So we want its opacity to drop to 0, but not immediately. We want it to sort of transition there over, I don't know, half a second. So in order to do that, we can create an animation from JavaScript to have that happen. So we're going to have to get access to this element, and then we're going to be able to trigger an animation on it. So let's get that trivia div, which was inside of our trivia container. So we're going to query selector for, let's see what class we actually have on that div that we could hook into. We do not have a class on this div. So we're going to throw a class on here. Class equals trivia item. And we're going to use that class to hook in and grab that div. So here we'll do query selector, trivia item, and we should be able to see that trivia div here if we print it out. And let's comment out this logic so that our question doesn't advance, so our div stays on the page here. And let's head to our console. Yeah, there we go. We got that div. So it's selecting just our question. The animation API is a little complicated, but basically what we can do for a simple animation is specify some keyframes. So here we're going to specify an array with some CSS properties that we want to change. So the opacity one, which I showed you in the browser, we're going to start at 1 and we're going to ask it to go to 0. And then we can declare some options for the animation, which allow us to specify how long it takes. So the duration property, we can specify in milliseconds. This is half of a second here. And let's just run with what we've got. And we will create our animation by talking to the trivia div and telling it to animate using these keyframes over these options. You can see Prettier kicked in and moved this all onto one line. It's the same code, it's just an object with CSS properties. So if all went well, click on it, it should fade. Don't worry about the fact that it is popping back to full opacity here after it fades. We're going to handle removing it from the page when it fades all the way out in a second. So the other thing I want to do is let's add a delay of 500 seconds so that when we click on it, we have a split second where we can display some feedback about whether it was correct or incorrect. And then I also want to change the easing. So you can look up easing curves if you're interested. This video is already running a little long, so I don't want to dive too deep into them, but they change how the keyframes are animated between. Okay, so we got our animation, and then much like with our add event listener, when we have an animation, we can listen for when it's finished. So here we can say animation dot add event listener finish and run a function when that animation is done. So let's just console log done here so that we can see something in the browser. So if I click on 6, fades, and then done. Fades, and then done. So when it's done, that's when we go ahead and do this logic that we were doing before, where we're clearing it, incrementing the index, going to the next one. And whoops, I took one too many bracket. There we go. So inside of our add event listener, we're clearing. we will increment the index, and we will check whether it's time for the game over or to go on to the next one. So fingers crossed here. Let's try getting it right. We see our score goes up, and then it fades, and the next one pops on. Fades, and our game is over. Because we only have 2 questions in this version. So now that the question stays on the page here, what we want to do is deactivate the buttons so that you can't, click multiple times. You can see my score went up to 6 from clicking so many times. So I want to deactivate the buttons after you pick one of these answers, and we want to change their color, their styling, so that the ones that you haven't clicked on are grayed out, and then the one that you do click on either turns green or red, based on whether you got it right or wrong. So this logic is going to go on our answer click. We're going to do it before we start checking whether they were right or wrong. The first thing we want to do is get all of those button elements and disable them. So our button elements, we can talk to our trivia container and we can do a query selector for them, much like we did, where did we do it? Right here, where we asked for all trivia item button classes. So query selector all. This should give us all of the buttons that then we can loop over. So I'm going to loop over each button using an arrow function here. And button.disabled, let's make sure that this works before we move on. When you set a button to disabled, that adds a property to that button that disables it. So if we go back and I try clicking on this multiple times, you can see my score only went up by 1. That's because all of these buttons had a disabled prop added to them. And disabled in the browser will prevent those clicks, will prevent user interaction. To make that visible, we can talk to the class list, which is a property that HTML elements have. And with class list, you can add, you can remove, you can, I believe, also toggle. Yes, toggle. So for instance, if we wanted to add a class, we do this and specify the class that we want to add. And here we want to add the class that corresponds, if we go back to our trivia item, to this disabled class here. So we're going to add trivia-item _ button -- disabled. So I'm just going to copy this without the period here, add it to my class list, and with these 2 lines of code, all of the buttons should be disabled and they should get grayed out. Perfect. So the next thing we want to do is take that button that we click on and selectively apply the class of either trivia item button correct or trivia item button incorrect. So down here, when we do our selected answer, we can use our target, which is the element that you clicked on, and change its class. So target.classList.add. So if we got it correct, we'll go ahead and grab the correct class. And if we got it incorrect, we're going to go ahead and drop in the incorrect class. So let's test that out. 8 is incorrect, so this should turn red. And I believe 5 was correct, so now it should turn green. Great. So because we have that animation where there's a split second where it pauses and then it fades out, we're giving the user a chance to actually see some feedback for whether they got it right or wrong. So the game should be infinitely more playable than the version without our animation and without our visual feedback here. So let's wrap it up with two things. One, I noticed as I was playing last time and I'm clicking through, the question number isn't changing. So I forgot that when we go ahead and change our index here and display the next trivia item, we should also update the question number. So that should fix our question. So it should go from 1 to 2. Great. And it should stay at 2 here. It shouldn't go to 3. So that's working. And then the other thing I want to fix is that it's a little jarring when we fade out and go to the next one. It's really sudden. So normally what you'd want to do is fade this out and fade the next one in. And luckily, that is pretty easy to do. So we just need to apply a similar structure here, but inside of our display trivia item. So here, the trivia item element that we are adding to the page, we want to apply our animation after we add it to the page here. So it's going to be a similar structure where we need to get access to our trivia div, and we are going to talk to our, we can really just do the same thing we were doing before, talk to our trivia container here and query selector for the trivia item, create our keyframes, which I'm going to grab what we created here for the keyframes and options and bring them up here. We just want to flip opacity to start at 0 and go to 1. And then for our options, we don't need a delay. And I'm going to flip this easing to ease out. So create our animation where we talk to our trivia div. Again, we ask it to animate, and here are the keyframes we want it to run through and the options. So if all goes well here, when I click, we should have it fade out and the next one fade in. And let's go ahead and go back to our trivia items, enable all of these. So if we give this a save and we run it, we can go to question 2, 3, and we should be able to get through all of our questions here one at a time with a nice fade transition between each question. So that's it for our game. We built a fairly functional game that is based off of this Trivia API data source, so later we'll be able to hook it up directly to this API if we want. And we created a fairly lengthy file here with a lot of code, a lot of asynchronous event listening, where we're setting up code to run when something happens. So you're kind of deep into JavaScript at this point and how JavaScript works and how building user interfaces works. What we're going to do now is, now that we've got our feet wet with building an application in JavaScript, just plain JavaScript with HTML and CSS, we're going to move into the world of React, which gives us a framework for how we structure our user interface code. So I'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the next one.